Hi, I'm Harley, and I'm back with a writing lesson video. Okay, editor's note real quick. There is a lot of background noise in this video, and I, for the life of me, cannot figure out how to, get rid of it. I didn't realize that my new phone picks up on so much more sound than what my old phone used to, because this is just, a lot. But I'm gonna do my best to dial it down and cut out as much of it as I can, but, I'm not going to refilm this whole video. I know I'm wearing the same shirt, but it's a week later. I've washed the shirt multiple times since then. Yeah, this. I'm so sorry. I did not realize that my phone would pick up on all of it so acutely, because I swear to God it's louder in the video than it was in real life. Anyway, back to the video. I'm aware that I'm way behind the times on the Hunger Games videos, but The Hunger Games has been one of my favorite books for a really long time, for 10 years now. It's been a long time since I first read that book. I love this series, and I have so many thoughts about this series, but today I'm going to specifically be talking about one thing, and that is the food. Now, this sounds odd, but listen to where I'm coming from. Food is something that is extremely important in the Hunger Games, from the fact that, the capital is basically starving the districts and forcing them into the Hunger Games every year. And winning districts get food and money, and you sign up for test right to get more money and food, or get more food for your family. And so food is a very important thing in the Hunger Games, but it's also a very important and personal thing to Katniss, our main character here. And it is something that she pays a lot of attention to throughout the story. I think I can look now, but the first mention of food in the Hunger Games is really early on, page 1 or 2. First mention is on page 2 of the Hunger Games. From there, we go on to get more mentions, and we learn why this is such an important thing. But you also have to think about why this is such an important thing from a character's perspective and from a writing perspective. From a writing perspective, this focus on food through the character's eyes is world building. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. World building is this big, complicated thing, and it is really hard to build what feels like a fully fleshed out world on page. It's hard. One of the things that I love to do, and I love when authors do, is there is one concept that your character is more acutely aware of than others. And this makes sense from a character perspective too, because no character is ever going to know everything. They're never going to be aware of everything. They're never going to be noticing everything. But they can be especially attentive to certain things. And through that character's eyes, we learn more details about that specific thing, which makes your world feel deeper. For Katniss, that's food and that's hunting, which are kind of all entwined. We see she hunts for food, she takes great care for her food, all this. She pays a lot of attention even to food in the capital, when she's in the capital before the games. And if you want examples from other stories, think of Shalon in the Stormlight Archives, who sees things in paintings through her art, and other characters in different stories. I've read stories where a character is a fashion designer, or they're really into fashion, so they notice what people are wearing, and we get a lot more depth into the fashion of the world. And this is a great way to just build layers into your story, especially if you have multiple points of view. But even with just one, it adds a lot of depth, because Katniss's attention to food in the series gives a lot of depth to the world, to her character, and to the theme of the story, which is something you want for this to do. When I'm writing, I like to introduce a concept, something that would make sense for my character to be attentive of. In my most recent story, Gulliver, the story about the gnome in the coffee shop, they focus on things that need to be fixed, because they're an inventor. And so they notice when things are ticking weirdly, or something doesn't sound quite right, because that's what their brain is wired to think about. And so throughout the story, we have these little references to different things in the world and what Gulliver thinks about them, and mechanical things that they notice and they want to fix, or they want to do better. And these are all details that add depth to the story. I can't get my hair to stay straight because it's kind of windy. Why food with Katniss? This is a good question. And I want you to understand this for when you're coming up with your thing for your own characters. Where does this come from? For Katniss, it's because they're starving. The districts are starving. She learned to hunt when she was very young with her father. She learned to gather food. So food has always been this very intrinsic part of her. Not just because everyone is starving in the districts, but because this was a thing that she did with her father, which is the character aspect, whereas the starving and the Hunger Games would be the world building aspect of this concept. And so she's very young and she's hunting and gathering with her father. And then the father dies and Peeta gives the bread. This is a center point of Katniss's character, and also for the plot of the Hunger Games, because if that hadn't happened, the book as a whole would not have happened. Katniss wouldn't have lived to be at the reaping and volunteer for her sister. Or if she was, she would never have cared about Peeta. Peeta wouldn't have cared about her either. So this is a center point to the story that triggers a lot of what comes. So this is one thing when you are looking for, like, what's your character's concept? What can I focus on to give this character and the world more depth? You want something that ties into your character, into the plot, and into the world building. And if you can, tie it into your theme as well, but that doesn't always work. Food for Katniss is quite literally the center point of her story, in so many ways. So from the bread, then we see her learn to hunt by herself, gather. She's providing for her family, and then she goes into the Hunger Games, and it's still this extremely important thing throughout the story. But why does this matter? Why does it matter? Could you have the same story without all this? I'd argue no, you can't. And it wouldn't have the depth and the meaning that it does without this element, which is something that you want in your own writing. You want to see a character, something that the character focuses on, and something that is the center point of their story. It's something that they always bring back to. It's something that the narration can connect to. It's something that the reader can connect to. They see all this line up and they're like, oh, this makes sense. It makes sense why the character would notice this but not this. It makes sense why the character would take this action because this happened. And it's very important to give depth to your character and to the world and to your plot. I know, like, here, food first comes up on page 2. Page 2, we are introduced to the importance of food. In Gulliver, I think maybe it was page 1 or 2, it's around the same. You want to introduce that around the same time. Something that the character pays a lot of attention to, and that will be important later on. And it doesn't even have to be a big thing. Like, not as big as Katniss with the food. Maybe your character is really into fashion, and somewhere along the lines, this becomes relevant. She notices how people dress. Maybe at the end, she notices, oh, hey, this villain wears kind of similar style to this one person, this seemingly unassuming person. And it connects in their brain. This adds depth to your character and how they understand the world and how they process the world. And it also, from a writing standpoint, more than like a narration storytelling standpoint, from a writing standpoint, it makes a lot of things easier. Instead of trying to struggle and make the character notice everything and see everything, you have this one thing that they focus on and they pay attention to and they notice, which makes it a little bit easier to define how you're going to narrate your character and how you're going to write them. So it makes the whole narration process of storytelling just a little bit easier, which is something I like as a writer because I struggled for a long time with descriptions and I didn't know where to focus and they were always scattered and all over the place. And I was trying to give you all the details. But when I started to understand this idea that no character can know everything, but a character can know one thing really well, then my narration started to be more focused and I could give what felt like purposeful descriptions and narration without bogging down the story with details that don't matter to the character or to the plot or world, at least the world through this character's lens. Which, when you're writing a story, that's all that matters. All this extra world building, and I love world building. If it doesn't matter to the character's lens and their worldview, and it doesn't show up in the plot and interfere with their worldview, it doesn't really matter. It's not really relevant. What's relevant is what the character knows of the world, what the character will learn of the world, and what they notice as they go through the world. Which is why sometimes there are stories where the world building feels incongruous with the rest of your story. Or just, it doesn't feel like it fits. It doesn't feel like the character fits in the world, and it's because you're focusing on too broad of a picture. This narrows your focus and gives you something concrete to begin to build on. I'm sure that this was not the first thing that Suzanne Collins came up with, but it is something that she chose to focus on through the Hunger Games and even in the prequel book with President Snow. Food is something that she chooses to focus on, and it is a focal point throughout her story as a whole. And it gives us a lot of, I don't want to say depth, it does give depth, but it gives us like a through line through which to view the story. And it makes it a little bit easier as a reader to digest as well. Where do you begin in your writing when you want to do something like this? And I think everybody should. But where do you begin? First, you take your character and you look at their backstory and you look at the world building and you think, what is going to be relevant to this character when it comes to the world and their backstory? How does this connect with the plot to introduce something meaningful and give us a focal point to focus on throughout the story? It may take some time to find what it is that your character focuses on, especially if it's your first time doing this. But as you do it more, it will become more natural and it will be easier to find this through point and focus on it and stop worrying about all these extra details that don't really matter to your narrative, which is the most important thing. You don't want to have a narrative that is scattered. It makes everything really complicated and it doesn't lead to a very enjoyable book. But when your narrative is focused, then your reader is going to enjoy it more. It makes you seem like you know what you're doing and what story you want to tell. And it also makes more sense because as people, we're not focused on everything all at once, most of the time. We generally have one thing that we're focused on, and we're focused on this one thing right in front of us. I've also had this deep connection to food, so it made it easier for me to understand what this connection in the Hunger Games. But everybody is different, and you have to find something that makes sense for your character. For some people, it may be sports. For others, it may be their family. It may be their career. It may be something that happened during their childhood. It may be art, like it is with Shalon in the Stormlight Archives. That's something that is her focal point. You want to look to another example from the Stormlight Archives, Kaladin and him being a surgeon. These are all things that these characters, that are very relevant to these characters, and so they're relevant to us and they're relevant to the narrative, and it gives us a through line throughout the narrative to focus on. And it's not something that needs to be on every single page, but it does make it better. It does make your story better when you have this focal point and you're able to keep bringing it back up. And it's like, yes, this character feels real because they're thinking about things and it keeps coming back up, and this is something that they notice. Like, I can't count the number of times Katniss notices food throughout the series, or she goes hunting, or she goes gathering, and even down to the very, very end of the first Hunger Games book with the berries. That's once again brought back to food, and it is relevant to the world, and is relevant with her backstory and her character, and it all leads to this very satisfying climax in the book. Really, the Hunger Games is a great study on this, and I could talk forever about the Hunger Games. But I really want you to think about how food is such a focal point throughout the Hunger Games, and how it kind of coincides with every major plot point that happens, and how you can bring that same intention into your own series to make a better, more intentional story. It is getting very windy, and my notes and my book are flying everywhere. But this is just something that I have thought about for a very long time, and I enjoy doing in my own writing, and I believe it has made my own writing better. So I wanted to come and I wanted to share it with you guys in hopes that it also makes writing your stories better. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.